Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Story of Extinct Civilizations of the West by Robert E. Anderson. Chapter 7, Cortés and Montezuma.
We have now seen the Spanish conquerors, with a large contingent of 6,000 natives, surmounting the mountains to the east of the Mexican Valley and looking down upon the lake of Texcoco, on which were built the sister capitals. Montezuma, the Aztec monarch, was already in a state of dismay, and sent still another embassy to propitiate the terrible Cortés, with a great present of gold and robes of the most precious fabrics and workmanship, and a promise that, if the foreign general would turn back toward Vera Cruz, the Mexicans would pay down 4 loads of gold for himself and 1 to each of his captains, besides a yearly tribute to their king in Europe. These promises did not reach Cortés till he was descending from the Sierra. He replied that details were best arranged by a personal interview, and that the Spaniards came with peaceful motives. Montezuma was now plunged in deep despair. At last he summoned a council to consult his nobles, and especially his nephew, the young king of Texcoco, and his warlike brother. The latter advised him to muster as large an army as possible and drive back the invaders from his capital or die in its defense. "Ah," replied the monarch, "the gods have declared themselves against us." Still another embassy was prepared, with his nephew, Lord of Texcoco, at its head, to offer a welcome to the unwelcome visitors. Cortés approached through fertile fields, plantations, and maguey vineyards till they reached Lake Chalco. There they found a large town built in the water on piles, with canals instead of streets, full of movement and animation. The Spaniards were particularly struck with the style and commodious structure of the houses, chiefly of stone, and with the general aspect of wealth and even elegance which prevailed. Next morning the king of Texcoco came to visit Cortés, in a palanquin richly decorated with plates of gold and precious stones, under a canopy of green plumes. He was accompanied by a numerous suite. Advancing with the Mexican salutation, he said he had been commanded by Montezuma to welcome him to the capital, at the same time offering 3 splendid pearls as a present. Cortés, in return, threw over the young king's neck a chain of cut glass, which, where glass was as rare as diamonds, might be admitted to have a value as real as the latter. The army of Cortés next marched along the southern side of Lake Chalco, through noble woods and by orchards glowing with autumnal fruits, of unknown names, but rich and tempting hues. They also passed through cultivated fields waving with the yellow harvest, and irrigated by canals introduced from the neighboring lake, the whole showing a careful and economical husbandry, essential to the maintenance of a crowded population. A remarkable public work next engaged the attention of the Spaniards, viz., a solid causeway of stone and lime running directly through the lake, in some places so wide that 8 horsemen could ride on it abreast. Its length is some 4 or 5 miles. Marching along this causeway, they saw other wonders, numbers of the natives darting in all directions in their skiffs, curious to watch the strangers marching, and some of them bearing the products of the country to the neighboring cities. They were amazed also by the sight of the floating gardens, teeming with flowers and vegetables, and moving like rafts over the waters. All round the margin, and occasionally far in the lake, they beheld little towns and villages, which half concealed by the foliage and gathered in white clusters round the shore, looked in the distance like companies of white swans riding quietly on the waves. About the middle of this lake was a town, to which the Spaniards gave the name of Venezuela, i.e. Little Venice. From its situation and the style of the buildings, Cortés called it the most beautiful town that he had yet seen in New Spain. After crossing the Isthmus, which separates that lake from Lake Texcoco, they were now at Iztapalapan, a royal residence in charge of the emperor's brother. Here a ceremonious reception was given to Cortés and his staff, a collation being served in one of the great halls of the palace. The excellence of the architecture here excited the admiration of the general. The buildings were of stone, and the spacious apartments had roofs of odorous cedar wood, while the walls were tapestried with fine cotton stained with brilliant colors. But the pride of Iztapalapan was its celebrated gardens, covering an immense tract of land and laid out in regular squares. The gardens were stocked with fruit trees and with the gaudy family of flowers which belonged to the Mexican flora, scientifically arranged and growing luxuriant in the equable temperature of the tableland. In one quarter was an aviary filled with numerous kinds of birds, remarkable in this region both for brilliancy of plumage and for song. But the most elaborate piece of work was a huge reservoir of stone filled to a considerable height with water, well supplied with different sorts of fish. This basin was 1,600 paces in circumference and surrounded by a walk. Readers must remember that at that age no beautiful gardens on a large scale were known in any part of Europe. The first garden of plants, to use the name afterward applied by the French, is said to have been an Italian one at Padua in 1545, a whole generation after the time of the arrival of Cortés in Mexico. It was only under Louis le Magnifique that France created the Versailles Gardens, and not till the time of George III and his tutor Bute could we boast of the gardens at Kew, now admired by all the world. The ancient Mexicans, therefore, under their extinct civilization, had developed this taste for the beautiful many ages before the most cultivated races in Europe. Cortés took up his quarters at this residence of Iztapalapan for the night, expecting to meet Montezuma on the morrow. Mexico was now distinctly full in view, looking like a thing of fairy creation, a city of enchantment, quote. There Aztlan stood upon the farther shore. Amid the shade of trees its dwellings rose, their level roofs with turrets set around, and battlements all burnished white, which shone like silver in the sunshine. I beheld the imperial city, her far-circling walls, her garden groves and stately palaces, her temples mountain-size, her 1,000 roofs, and when I saw her might and majesty, my mind misgave me then." Unquote. That following day, November 8, 1519, should be noted in every calendar, when the great capital of the Western world admitted the conquering general from the Eastern world. The invaders were now upon a larger causeway, which stretched across the salt waters of Lake Texcoco, and had occasion more than ever to admire the mechanical science of the Aztecs. It was wide enough throughout its whole extent for 10 horsemen to ride abreast. The Spaniards saw everywhere evidence of a crowded and thriving population exceeding all they had yet seen. The water was darkened by swarms of canoes filled with Indians, and here also were those fairy islands of flowers. Half a league from the capital they encountered a solid work of stone which traversed the road. It was 12 feet high, strengthened by towers at the extremities, and in the center was a battlemented gateway, which opened a passage to the troops. Here they were met by several hundred Aztec chiefs, who came out to announce the approach of Montezuma and to welcome the Spaniards to his capital. They were dressed in the fanciful gala costume of the country, with the cotton sash around their loins, and a broad mantle of the same material, or of the brilliant feather embroidery, flowing gracefully down their shoulders. On their necks and arms they displayed collars and bracelets of turquoise mosaic, with which delicate plumage was curiously mingled, while their ears, under lips, and occasionally their noses were garnished with pendants formed of precious stones or crescents of fine gold. After all the caziques had performed the same formal salutation separately, there was no further delay till they reached a bridge near the gates of the capital. Soon after, they beheld the glittering retinue of the emperor emerging from the great street leading through the heart of the city. Amid a crowd of Indian nobles, preceded by 3 officers of state bearing golden wands, they saw the royal palanquin blazing with burnished gold. It was borne on the shoulders of nobles, and over it a canopy of gaudy featherwork, covered with jewels and fringed with silver, was supported by 4 attendants of the same rank. At a certain distance from the Spaniards, the train halted, and Montezuma, descending from the litter, came forward, leaning on the arms of the lords of Texcoco and Iztapalapan, the emperor's nephew and brother, already mentioned. As the monarch advanced, his subjects, who lined the sides of the causeway, bent forward with their eyes fastened on the ground as he passed. Montezuma wore the ample square cloak common to the Mexicans, but of the finest cotton sprinkled with pearls and precious stones. His sandals were similarly sprinkled and had soles of solid gold. His only head ornament was a bunch of feathers of the royal green color. a man about 40, tall and rather thin, black hair cut rather short for a person of rank, dignified in his movements, his features wearing an expression of benignity not to be expected from his character. After dismounting from horseback, Cortés advanced to meet Montezuma, who received him with princely courtesy, while Cortés responded by profound expressions of respect, with thanks for his experience of the emperor's munificence. He then hung round Montezuma's neck a sparkling chain of colored crystal, accompanying this with a movement as if to embrace him, when he was restrained by the two Aztec lords, shocked at the menaced profanation of the sacred person of their monarch and master. Montezuma appointed his brother to conduct the Spaniards to their residence in the capital, and was again carried through the adoring crowds in his litter. The Spaniards quickly followed, and with colors flying and music playing soon made their entrance into the southern quarter. On entering, they found fresh cause for admiration in the grandeur of the city and the superior style of its architecture. The great avenue through which they were now marching was lined with the houses of the nobles, who were encouraged by the emperor to make the capital their residence. The flat roofs were protected by stone parapets so that every house was a fortress. Sometimes these roofs seemed parterres of flowers. Broad terraced gardens laid out between the buildings. Occasionally, a great square intervened surrounded by its porticos of stone and stucco, or a pyramidal temple reared its colossal bulk crowned with its tapering sanctuaries and altars blazing with unextinguishable fires. But what most impressed the Spaniards was the throngs of people who swarmed through the streets and on the canals. Probably, however, the spectacle of the European army with their horses, their guns, bright swords and helmets of steel, a metal to them unknown, their weird and mysterious music, the whole formed to the Aztec populace an inexplicable wonder, combined with those foreigners who had arrived from the distant east, revealing their celestial origin in their fair complexions. Many of the Aztec citizens betrayed keen hatred of the Tlaxcalans who marched with the Spaniards in friendly alliance. At length Cortés with his mixed army halted near the center of the city in a great open space, where rose the huge pyramidal pile dedicated to the patron war god of the Aztecs, second only to the temple of Cholula in size as well as sanctity. The present famous cathedral of modern Mexico is built on part of the same site. A palace built opposite the west side of the great temple was assigned to Cortés. It was extensive enough to accommodate the whole of the army of Cortés. Montezuma paid him a visit there, having a long conversation through the indispensable assistance of Marina, the slave interpreter. That evening the Spaniards celebrated their arrival in the Mexican capital by a general discharge of artillery, the thunders of the ordnance reverberating among the buildings and shaking them to their foundations, the stench of the sulphurous vapor reminding the inhabitants of the explosions of the great volcano Popocatépetl, filled the hearts of the superstitious Aztecs with dismay. Next day Cortés had gracious permission to return the visit of the emperor, and therefore proceeded to wait upon him at the royal palace, dressed in his richest suit of clothes. The Spanish general felt the importance of the occasion and resolved to exercise all his eloquence and power of argument in attempting the conversion of Montezuma to the Christian faith. For this purpose, with the assistance of the faithful Marina, Cortés engaged the emperor in a theological discussion, explaining the creation of the world as taught in the Jewish scriptures, the fall of man from his first happy and holy condition by the temptation of Satan, the mysterious redemption of the human race by the incarnation and atonement of the Son of God himself. He assured Montezuma that the idols worshipped in Mexico were Satan under different forms. A sufficient proof of this was the bloody sacrifices they imposed, which he contrasted with the pure and simple rite of the Mass. It was to snatch the emperor's soul and the souls of his people from the flames of eternal fire that the Christians had come to this land. Montezuma replied that the God of the Spaniards must be a good being, and my gods also are good to me. There was no need to further discourse on the matter. If he had resisted their visit to his capital, it was because he had heard such accounts of their cruelties, that they sent the lightning to consume his people, or crushed them to pieces under the hard feet of the ferocious animals on which they rode. He was now convinced that these were idle tales, that the Spaniards were kind and generous in their nature. He concluded by admitting the superiority of the sovereign of Cortés beyond the seas. "Your sovereign is the rightful lord of all. I rule in his name." The rough Spanish cavaliers were touched by the kindness and affability of Montezuma. As they passed him, says Diaz, in his history, they made him the most profound obeisance, hat in hand, and on the way home could discourse of nothing but the gentle breeding and courtesy of the Indian monarch. Cortés and his army being now fairly domesticated in Mexico, and the emperor having apparently become reconciled to the presence of his formidable guests, we may pause to consider the surroundings. The present capital occupies the site of Tenochtitlan, but many changes have occurred in the intervening 4 centuries. First of all, the salt waters of the Great Lake have entirely shrunk away, leaving modern Mexico high and dry, a league away from the waters that Cortés saw flowing in ample canals through all the streets. Formerly the houses stood on elevated piles and were independent of the floods which rose in Lake Texcoco by the overflowing of other lakes on a higher level. But when the foundations were on solid ground, it became necessary to provide against the accumulated volume of water by excavating a tunnel to drain off the flood. This was constructed about 100 years after the invasion of the Spaniards, and has been described by Humboldt as one of the most stupendous hydraulic works in existence. The appearance of the lake and suburbs of the capital have long lost much of the attractive appearance they had at the time of the Spanish visit, but the town itself is still the most brilliant city in Spanish America, surmounted by a cathedral, which forms the most sumptuous house of worship in the New World. The great causeway already described as leading north from the royal city of Iztapalapan had another to the north of the capital, which might be called its continuation. The third causeway, leading west to the town Tacuba from the island city, will be noticed presently as the scene of the Spaniards' retreat. There were excellent police regulations for health and cleanliness. Water supplied by earthen pipes was from a hill about 2 miles distant. Besides the palaces and temples, there were several important buildings: an armory filled with weapons and military dresses, a granary, various warehouses, an immense aviary, with birds of splendid plumage assembled from all parts of the empire, the scarlet cardinal, the golden pheasant, the endless parrot tribe, and that miniature miracle of nature, the hummingbird, which delights to revel among the honeysuckle bowers of Mexico. The birds of prey had a separate building. The menagerie adjoining the aviary showed wild animals from the mountain forests, as well as creatures from the remote swamps of the hot lands by the seashore. The serpents were confined in long cages lined with down or feathers, or in troughs of mud and water. Wishing to visit the great Mexican temple, Cortés, with his cavalry and most of his infantry, followed the caciques whom Montezuma had politely sent as guides. On their way to the central square, the Spaniards were struck with the appearance of the inhabitants, and their great superiority in the style and quality of their dress over the people of the lower countries. The women, as in other parts of the country, seemed to go about as freely as the men. They wore several skirts or petticoats of different lengths, with highly ornamented borders, and sometimes over them loose-flowing robes which reached to the ankles. No veils were worn here as in some other parts of Anahuac. The Aztec women had their faces exposed, and their dark raven tresses floated luxuriantly over their shoulders, revealing features which, although of a dusky or rather cinnamon hue, were not unfrequently pleasing, while touched with the serious, even sad expression characteristic of the national physiognomy. When near the great market, the Spaniards were astonished at the throng of people pressing toward it, and on entering the place their surprise was still further heightened by the sight of the multitudes assembled there, and the dimensions of the enclosure, twice as large, says one Spanish observer, as the celebrated square of Salamanca. Here were traders from all parts, the goldsmiths from Azcapotzalco, the potters and jewelers of Cholula, the painters of Texcoco, the stone-cutters, hunters, fishermen, fruiterers, mat and chair makers, florists, etc. The pottery department was a large one, so were the armories for implements of war, razors and mirrors booths for apothecaries with drugs, roots, and medical preparations. In other places again, blank books or maps for the hieroglyphics or pictographs were to be seen folded together like fans. Animals both wild and tame were offered for sale, and near them, perhaps, a gang of slaves with collars round their necks. One of the most attractive features of the market was the display of provisions, meats of all kinds, domestic poultry, game from the neighboring mountains, fish from the lakes and streams, fruits in all the delicious abundance of these temperate regions, green vegetables, and the unfailing maize. This market, like hundreds of smaller ones, was of course held every 5th day, the week of the ancient Mexicans being 1/4 of the 20 days which constituted the Aztec month. This great market was comparable to the periodical fairs in Europe, not as they now exist, but as they existed in the Middle Ages, when from the difficulties of intercommunication they served as the great central marts for commercial intercourse, exercising a most important and salutary influence on the community. One of the Spaniards in the party accompanying Cortés was the historian Diaz, and his testimony is remarkable. Quote, "There were among us soldiers who had been in many parts of the world, Constantinople and Rome, and through all Italy, and who said that a marketplace so large, so well ordered and regulated, and so filled with people, they had never seen." Unquote. Proceeding next to the great Teocalli, or Aztec temple, covering the site of the modern cathedral with part of the marketplace and some adjoining streets, they found it in the midst of a great open space, surrounded by a high stone wall, ornamented on the outside by figures of serpents raised in relief, and pierced by huge battlemented gateways opening on the 4 principal streets of the capital. The Teocalli itself was a solid pyramidal structure of earth and pebbles, coated on the outside with hewn stones, the sides facing the cardinal points. It was divided into 5 stories, each of smaller dimensions than that immediately below. The ascent was by a flight of steps on the outside, which reached to the narrow terrace at the bottom of the 2nd story, passing quite round the building, when a 2nd stairway conducted to a similar landing at the base of the 3rd. Thus the visitor was obliged to pass round the whole edifice 4 times in order to reach the top. This had a most imposing effect in the religious ceremonials, when the pompous procession of priests with their wild minstrelsy came sweeping round the huge sides of the pyramid, as they rose higher and higher toward the summit in full view of the populace assembled in their thousands. Cortés marched up the steps at the head of his men, and found at the summit a vast area paved with broad, flat stones. The first object that met their view was a large block of jasper, the peculiar shape of which showed it was the stone on which the bodies of the unhappy victims were stretched for sacrifice. Its convex surface, by raising the breast, enabled the priest to perform more easily his diabolical task of removing the heart. At the other end of the area were 2 towers or sanctuaries, consisting of 3 stories, the lower one of stone, the 2 upper of wood, elaborately carved. In the lower division stood the images of their gods. The apartments above were filled with utensils for their religious services, and with the ashes of some of their Aztec princes who had fancied this airy sepulture. Before each sanctuary stood an altar, with that undying fire upon it, the extinction of which boded as much evil to the empire as that of the Vestal flame would have done in ancient Rome. Here also was the huge cylindrical drum made of serpent skins, and struck only on extraordinary occasions, when it sent forth a melancholy, weird sound that might be heard for miles over the country, indicating fierce anger of deity against the enemies of Mexico. As Cortés reached the summit, he was met by the emperor himself, attended by the high priest. Taking the general by the hand, Montezuma pointed out the chief localities in the wide prospect which their position commanded, including not only the capital, bathed on all sides by the salt floods of the Texcoco, and in the distance the clear fresh waters of Lake Chalco, but the whole of the Valley of Mexico to the base of the circular range of mountains, and the wreaths of vapor rolling up from the hoary head of Popocatépetl. Cortés was allowed to behold the shrines of the gods. They found themselves in a spacious apartment with sculptures on the walls representing the Mexican calendar or the priestly ritual. Before the altar in this sanctuary stood the colossal image of Huitzilopochtli, the tutelary deity and war god of the Aztecs. His countenance was distorted into hideous lineaments of symbolical import. The huge folds of a serpent, consisting of pearls and precious stones, were coiled round his waist, and the same rich materials were profusely sprinkled over his person. On his left foot were the delicate feathers of the hummingbird, which gave its name to the dread deity. The most conspicuous ornament was a chain of gold and silver hearts alternate, suspended round his neck, emblematical of the sacrifice in which he most delighted. A more unequivocal evidence of this was afforded by 3 human hearts that now lay smoking on the altar before him. The adjoining sanctuary was dedicated to a milder deity. This was Tezcatlipoca, who created the world, next in honor to that invisible being, the supreme god, who was represented by no image and confined by no temple. He was represented as a young man, and his image of polished black stone was richly garnished with gold plates and ornaments. But the homage to this god was not always of a more refined or merciful character than that paid to his carnivorous brother. According to Diaz, whom we have already quoted, the stench of human gore in both those chapels was more intolerable than that of all the slaughterhouses in Castile. Glad to escape into the open air, Cortés expressed wonder that a great and wise prince like Montezuma could have faith in such evil spirits as these idols, the representatives of the devil. Permit us to erect here the true cross and place the images of the Blessed Virgin and her Son in these sanctuaries. You will soon see how your false gods will shrink before them. This extraordinary speech of the general shocked Montezuma, who, in reproof, said, "Had I thought you would have offered this outrage to the gods of the Aztecs, I would not have admitted you into their presence." Cortés, as a general, had some of the great qualities of Napoleon, but he also resembled him occasionally in a singular lack of delicacy and good taste. We do not, however, find that he ever showed such mean malignity as the French general did when persecuting Madame de Staël, because in her Germany she had omitted to mention his campaigns and administration. Within the same enclosure, Cortés and his companions visited a temple dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, a god referred to already. Other buildings served as seminaries for the instruction of youth of both sexes, and according to the Spanish accounts of the teaching and management of these institutions, there was the greatest care for morals and the most blameless deportment. After being guest of the Mexican emperor for a week, Cortés resolved to carry out a most daring and unprecedented scheme, a purely Napoleonic movement, such as could scarcely have entered the brain of any general ancient or modern. He argued with himself that a quarrel might at any moment break out between his men and the citizens. The Spaniards again could not remain long quiet unless actively employed. And thirdly, there was still greater danger with the Tlaxcalans, a fierce race now in daily contact with a nation that regards them with loathing and detestation. Lastly, the governor of Cuba, already grossly offended with Cortés, might at any moment send after him a sufficient army to wrest from him the glory of conquest. Cortés therefore formed the daring resolve to seize Montezuma in his palace and carry him as a prisoner to the Spanish quarters. He hoped thus to have in his own hands the supreme management of affairs, and at the same time secure his own safety with such a sacred pledge in keeping. It was necessary to find a pretext for seizing the hospitable Montezuma. News had already come to Cortés when at Cholula, that Escalante, whom he had left in charge of Veracruz, had been defeated by the Aztecs in a pitched battle, and that the head of a Spaniard then slain had been sent to the emperor after being shown in triumph throughout some of the chief cities. Cortés asked an audience from Montezuma, and that being readily granted, he prepared for his plot by having a large body of armed men posted in the courtyard. Choosing 5 companions of tried courage, Cortés then entered the palace, and after being graciously received, told Montezuma that he knew of the treachery that had taken place near the coast, and that the emperor was said to be the cause. The emperor said that such a charge could only have been concocted by his enemies. He agreed with the proposal of Cortés to summon the Aztec chief, who was accused of treachery to the garrison at Vera Cruz, and was then persuaded to transfer his residence to the palace occupied by the Spaniards. He was there received and treated with ostentatious respect, but his people observed that in front of the palace there was constantly posted a patrol of 60 soldiers, with another equally large in the rear. When the Aztec chief arrived from the coast, he and his 16 Aztec companions were condemned to be burned alive before the palace. The next daring act of the Spanish general was to order iron fetters to be fastened on Montezuma's ankles. The great emperor seemed struck with stupor and spoke never a word. Meanwhile, the Aztec chiefs were executed in the courtyard without interruption, the populace imagining the sentence had been passed upon them by Montezuma, and the victims submitting to their fate without a murmur. Cortés, returning then to the room where Montezuma was imprisoned, unclasped the fetters and said he was now at liberty to return to his own palace. The emperor, however, declined the offer. The instinctive sense of human sympathy must have frequently been not only repressed, but extinguished by all the great conquering generals who have crushed nations underfoot. Besides those of prehistoric times in Asia and Europe, we have examples in Alexander the Greek, Julius Caesar the Roman, Cortés and Pizarro the Spaniards, Frederick the Prussian, and Napoleon the Corsican. The great French general consciously aimed at dramatic effect in his exploits. But how paltry his seizing the Duc d'Enghien at dead of night by a troop of soldiers, or his coercing the King of Spain to resign his sovereignty after inducing him to cross the border into France. In the unparalleled case of Cortés, a powerful emperor is seized by a few strangers at noonday and carried off a prisoner without opposition or bloodshed. So extraordinary a transaction, says Robertson, would appear extravagant beyond the bounds of probability, were it not that all the circumstances are authenticated by the most unquestionable evidence. The nephew of Montezuma, Cacama, the lord of Tezcuco, had been closely watching all the motions of the Spaniards. He beheld with indignation and contempt the abject condition of his uncle, and now set about forming a league with several of the neighboring caciques to break the detested yoke of the Spaniards. News of this league reached the ears of Cortés, and arresting him with the permission of Montezuma, he deposed him and appointed a younger brother in his place. The other caciques were seized, each in his own city, and brought to Mexico, where Cortés placed them in strict confinement along with Cacama. The next step taken by Cortés was to demand from Montezuma an acknowledgment of the supremacy of the Spanish emperor. The Aztec monarch and chief caciques easily granted this, and even agreed that a gratuity should be sent by each of them as proof of loyalty. Collectors were sent out, and in a few weeks most of them returned, bringing back large quantities of gold and silver plate, rich stuffs, etc. To this Montezuma added a huge hoard, the treasures of his father. When brought into the quarters, the gold alone was sufficient to make 3 great heaps. It consisted partly of native grains and partly of bars, but the greatest portion was in utensils and various kinds of ornaments and curious toys, together with imitations of birds, insects, or flowers, executed with uncommon truth and delicacy. There were also quantities of collars, bracelets, wands, fans, and other trinkets, in which the gold and feather work were richly powdered with pearls and precious stones. Montezuma expressed regret that the treasure was no larger. He had diminished it, he said, by his former gifts to the white men. The Spaniards gazed on this display of riches, far exceeding all hitherto seen in the New World, though small compared with the quantity of treasure found in Peru. The whole amount of this Mexican gift was about 1,417,000 pounds, according to Prescott, Dr. Robertson making it smaller. It was no easy task to divide the spoil. A fifth had to be deducted for the crown, and an equal share went to the general, besides a large sum to indemnify him and the governor of Cuba for the charges of the expedition and the loss of the fleet. The garrison of Vera Cruz was also to be provided for. The cavalry, musketeers, and crossbowmen each received double pay. Thus, for each of the common soldiers there was only 100 gold pesos. To many this share seemed paltry, compared with their expectations, and it required all the tact and authority of Cortés to quell the grumbling. There still remained one important object of the Spanish invasion, an object which Cortés, as a good Catholic, dared not overlook: the conversion of the Aztec nation from heathenism. The bloody ritual of the Teocallis was still observed in every city. Cortés waited on Montezuma, urging a request that the great temple be assigned for public worship according to the Christian rites. Montezuma was evidently much alarmed, declaring that his people would never allow such a profanation, but at last, after consulting the priest, agreed that one of the sanctuaries on the summit of the temple should be granted to the Christians as a place of worship. An altar was raised, surmounted by a crucifix and the image of the Virgin. The whole army ascended the steps in solemn procession and listened with silent reverence to the service of the Mass. In conclusion, as the beautiful Te Deum rose toward heaven, Cortés and his soldiers, kneeling on the ground, with tears streaming from their eyes, poured forth their gratitude to the Almighty for this glorious triumph of the cross. Such a union of heathenism and Christianity was too unnatural to continue. A few days later, the emperor sent for Cortés and earnestly advised him to leave the country at once. Cortés replied that ships were necessary. Montezuma agreed to supply timber and workmen, and in a short time the construction of several ships was begun at Veracruz on the seacoast, while in the capital the garrison kept itself ready by day and by night for a hostile attack. Only 6 months had elapsed since the arrival of the Spaniards in the capital, 1519, and now the army was in more uncomfortable circumstances than ever. Meanwhile, while Cortés had been reducing Mexico and humbling the unfortunate Montezuma, the governor of Cuba had complained to the court of Spain, but without success. Charles V, since his election to the imperial crown of Germany, had neglected the affairs of Spain. And when the envoys from Veracruz waited upon him, little came of the conference except the astonishment of the court at the quantity of gold, and the beautiful workmanship of the ornaments, and the rich colors of the Mexican featherwork. The opposition of the Bishop of Burgos thwarted the conqueror of Mexico, as he had already successfully opposed the schemes of the great admiral and his son, Diego Columbus. We shall presently see how this influential ecclesiastic was able to thwart Balboa when governor of Darien. Velázquez was now determined to wreak his revenge upon Cortés without waiting longer for assistance from Spain. He prepared an expedition of 18 ships with 80 horsemen, 800 infantry, 120 crossbowmen, and 12 pieces of artillery. To command these, Velázquez chose a hidalgo named Narvaez, who had assisted formerly in subduing Cuba and Hispaniola. The personal appearance of Narvaez, as given by Diaz, is worth quoting. He was tall, stout-limbed, with a large head and red beard, an agreeable presence, a voice deep and sonorous as if it rose from a cavern. He was a good horseman and valiant." Unquote. Meanwhile, Cortés persuaded Montezuma that some friends from Spain had arrived at Veracruz, and therefore got permission to leave him in the capital in charge of Alvarado and a small garrison. Montezuma, in his royal litter, borne on the shoulders of his Aztec nobles, accompanied the Spanish general to the southern causeway. When Cortés was within 15 leagues distance of Zempoala, where Narvaez was encamped, the latter sent a message that if his authority were acknowledged, he would supply ships to Cortés and his army, so that all who wished might freely leave the country with all their property. Cortés, however, with his usual astuteness, replied, "If Narvaez bears a royal commission, I will readily submit to him, but he has produced none. He is a deputy of my rival, Velázquez. For myself, I am a servant of the king. I have conquered the country for him, and for him I and my brave followers will defend it to the last drop of our blood. If we fall, it will be glory enough to have perished in the discharge of our duty." Narvaez and his army were meantime spending their time frivolously, and when the actual attack was begun in the dead of night, under a pouring rainstorm, it appeared that only 2 sentinels were on guard. Narvaez, badly wounded, was taken prisoner on the top of a teocalli, and in a very short time his army was glad to capitulate. The horse soldiers whom Narvaez had sent to waylay one of the roads to Zempoala rode in soon after to tender their submission. The victorious general, seated in a chair of state, with a richly embroidered Mexican mantle on his shoulders, received his congratulations from the officers and soldiers of both armies. Narvaez and several others were led in chains. Cortés not only defeated Narvaez, but after the battle, enlisted under his standard the Spanish soldiers who had been sent to attack him, reminding one of the magnetism of Hannibal or Napoleon and the consequent enthusiasm caused by mere presence, looks, and words. Before the rejoicings were finished, however, tidings were brought to Cortés from the Mexican capital that the whole city was in a state of revolt against Alvarado. On his march back to the Great Plateau, Cortés found the inhabitants of Tlaxcala still friendly and willing to assist as allies in the struggle against their ancient foes, the Mexicans. On reaching the camp of the Spaniards in Mexico, Cortés found that Alvarado had provoked the insurrection by a massacre of the Aztec populace. Having entered the precincts with his army, Cortés at once made anxious preparations for the siege which was threatened by the Aztecs, now assembling in thousands. As the assailants approached, they set up a hideous yell, or rather that shrill whistle used in fight by the nations of Anahuac. Accompanied by the sound of shell and atabal, and their other rude instruments of wild music. This was followed by a tempest of missiles, stones, darts, and arrows. The Spaniards waited until the foremost column had arrived within distance, when a general discharge of artillery and muskets swept the ranks of the assailants. Never till now had the Mexicans witnessed the murderous power of these formidable engines. At first they stood aghast, but soon rallying, they rushed forward over the prostrate bodies of their comrades. Pressing on, some of them tried to scale the parapet, while others tried to force a breach in it. When the parapet proved too strong, they shot burning arrows upon the wooden outworks. Next day there were continually fresh supplies of warriors added to the forces of the assailants, so that the danger of the situation was greatly increased. Diaz, an onlooker, thus wrote, "The Mexicans fought with such ferocity that if we had been assisted by 10,000 Hectors and as many Orlandos, we should have made no impression on them. There were several of our troops who had served in the Italian wars, but neither there nor in the battles with the Turks had they ever seen anything like the desperation shown by these Indians." Unquote. Cortés at last drew off his men and sounded a retreat, taking refuge in the fortress. The Mexicans encamped round it, and during the night insulted the besieged, shouting, "The gods have at last delivered you into our hands. The stone of sacrifice is ready. The knives are sharpened." Cortés now felt that he had not fully understood the character of the Mexicans. The patience and submission formerly shown in deference to the injured Montezuma was now replaced by concentrated arrogance and ferocity. The Spanish general even stooped to request the interposition of the Aztec emperor, and at last, when assured that the foreigners would leave his country if a way were opened through the Mexican army, he agreed to use his influence. For this purpose, quote, he put on his imperial robes, his mantle of white and blue flowed over his shoulders, held together by its rich clasp of the green chalchivital. The same precious gem, with emeralds of uncommon size set in gold, profusely ornamented other parts of his dress. His feet were shod with the golden sandals, and his brows covered with the Mexican diadem, resembling in form the pontifical tiara. Thus attired and surrounded by a guard of Spaniards and several Aztec nobles, and preceded by the golden wand, the symbol of sovereignty, the Indian monarch ascended the central turret of the palace. Unquote. At the sight of Montezuma, all the Mexican army became silent, partly, no doubt, from curiosity. He assured them that he was no prisoner, that the strangers were his friends, and would leave Mexico of their own accord as soon as a way was opened. To call himself a friend of the hateful Spaniards was a fatal argument. Instead of respecting their monarch, though in his official robes the populace howled angry curses at him as a degenerate Aztec, a coward, no longer a warrior or even a man, a cloud of missiles was hurled at Montezuma, and he was struck to the ground by the blow of a stone on his head. The unfortunate monarch only survived his wounds for a few days, disdaining to take any nourishment or to receive advice from the Spanish priests. Meanwhile, Cortés and his army met with an unexpected danger. A large body of the Indian warriors had taken possession of the great temple, at a short distance from the Spanish quarters. From this commanding position they kept shooting a deadly flight of arrows on the Spaniards. Cortés sent his chamberlain Escobar with a body of men to storm the temple, but after 3 efforts, the party had to relinquish the attempt. Cortés himself then led a storming party, and after some determined fighting reached the platform at the top of the temple, where the 2 sanctuaries of the Aztec deities stood. This large area was now the scene of a desperate battle, fought in sight of the whole capital as well as of the Spanish troops still remaining in the courtyard. This struggle between such deadly enemies caused dreadful carnage on both sides. Quote, "The edge of the area was unprotected by parapet or battlement, and the combatants, as they struggled in mortal agony, were sometimes seen to roll over the sheer sides of the precipice together. Cortés himself had a narrow escape from this dreadful fate. The number of the enemy was double that of the Christians, but the invulnerable armor of the Spaniard, his sword of matchless temper, and his skill in the use of it, gave him advantages which far outweighed the odds of physical strength and numbers." Unquote. This unparalleled scene of bloodshed lasted for 3 hours. Of the Mexicans, 2 or 3 priests only survived to be led away in triumph. Yet the loss of the Spaniards was serious enough, amounting to 45 of their best men. Nearly all the others were wounded, some seriously. After dragging the uncouth monster, Huitzilopochtli, from his sanctuary, the assailants hurled the repulsive image down the steps of the temple, and then set fire to the building. The same evening they burned a large part of the town. Cortés now resolved upon a night retreat from the capital. But when marching along one of the causeways, they were attacked by the Mexicans in such numbers that, when morning dawned, the shattered battalion was reduced to less than half its number. In after years, that disastrous retreat was known to the Spanish chroniclers as Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. After a hurried 6 days' march before the pursuers, Cortés gained a victory so signal that an alliance was speedily formed with Tlaxcala against Mexico. Cortés built 12 brigantines at Veracruz in order to secure the command of Lake Texcoco and thus attempt the reduction of the Mexican capital. On his return to the Great Lake, he found that the throne was now occupied by Guatemozin, a nephew of Montezuma. Using their brigantines, the Spanish soldiers now began the siege of Mexico, the most memorable event in the conquest of America. It lasted 75 days, during which the whole of the capital was reduced to ruins. Guatemozin, the last of the Aztec emperors, was condemned by the Spanish general to be hanged on the charge of treason. Cortés was now master of all Mexico. The Spanish court and people were full of admiration for his victories and the extent of his conquests, and Charles V appointed him Captain General and Governor of New Spain. On revisiting Europe, the emperor honored him with the Order of St. Jago and the title of Marquis. Latterly, however, after some failures in his exploring expeditions, Cortés, on his return to Spain, found himself treated with neglect. It was then, according to Voltaire's story, that when Charles asked the courtiers, "Who is that man?" referring to Cortés, the latter said aloud, "It is one, sire, that has added more provinces to your dominions than any other governor has added towns." Cortés died in his 62nd year, December 2nd, 1547.
This concludes today's reading of The Story of Extinct Civilizations of the West by Robert E. Anderson. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.